This is an audio read transcript of the ABC TV program Rewind. It aired on Sunday, August 29, 2004 at 9:25 p.m. I'll shortly commence reading the explosive script. In light of recent COVID-19 events relating to China, the information in this program should be of interest to the world. The program has no available video outside the ABC. It's been scrubbed from the internet. So too has this script. However, it's still available on a protected archive mirror of the official ABC website. Pay careful attention to the reference of a diabolical plan devised by world-leading Australian virologist and Nobel laureate Sir Macfarlane Burnet. Presciently, Burnet warned about the rise of China, which is precisely what's happened. He proposed the use of a corona-influenza flu-like virus on China as a genocidal bioweapon. It was Burnet and his Australian CSIRO colleagues that used their unique skills eradicated plagues of rabbits that troubled Australian agriculture. They devised a genetically targeted virus that only affected rabbits. Killer viruses for humans occupied Burnet's mind. The protege of Sir Macfarlane Burnet was Sir Gustav Nossal. He is also linked to the World Health Organization. Even more disturbing, Nossal is linked to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. In this interview, Nossal claims he knew nothing about Burnet's views or work, which is astonishing at best, and deceptive at least. Burnet had written extensively about his eugenics views, and Nossal has worked closely with him. Burnet and Gates held common eugenics views about the world's population. They both believed it should be urgently reduced. Gates' views are on the record. He's given them in both interviews and his recent celebrated TED and World Economic Forum talks. He has given these talks to people who share his depopulation views. The following Rewind program transcript talks about plans for genocide. Declassified Australian intelligence documents were obtained by the Rewind program in 2004. The genocide plans were devised by Macfarlane Burnet for Australian, UK, and United States intelligence agencies. The plans involved genetically modified viruses to cull human populations. At the time, cooler intelligence heads prevailed and dismissed the plan. The main fear was virus blowback. At the time, Burnet could not guarantee the three allied nations would not be harmed should the pandemic go global, as has been the case with COVID-19. Bill Gates is on the record warning the world to expect waves of virulent viruses. He's proposing vaccines his foundation is financing. The Spanish flu of 1918 killed 50 million. The COVID-19 is a mild entry-level virus, yet nation after nation has shown inordinate and inexplicable panic. They are still refusing to end lockdowns or social distancing. What do they know about what's coming? Why are they insisting on a new abnormal, telling us our lives will not return to pre-COVID-19? With the passage of time, Burnet's diabolical and genocidal plan might no longer be so absurd. Killer viruses can now be targeted for humans with $150 CRISPR genetic modification kits bought off the internet. Whilst no nation today might attempt such horrific genocidal acts, it's not beyond the realm of corporations and malevolent individuals to unleash Armageddon for profit, power, control, or political ends. You decide. Make no mistake, the targeted technology Burnet dreamed about now exists. COVID-19 might have indeed been a dry run to assess how nations might respond before the Gates nightmare comes true, which profits pharmaceutical companies including those owned by Gates's foundation. The defenses of nations have been probed, their responses watched. Populations' mindsets have been conditioned for mass deaths by an unseen enemy, except it's no pandemic. As you will ominously hear in this program, pandemics are real despite the excuses the Rewind program makes to diminish the culpability of those it mentions. After all, the ABC is a government national broadcaster. It inadvertently produced a program it should not have produced, as the passage of time has proven. The ABC has now consequently made the program disappear, but we have it here for you to listen to. On the night of August 29, 2004, the Rewind program began as thus. Program read begins. Rewind reveals that Australian Nobel Prize winner Sir Macfarlane Burnet was a champion of biological warfare in the 1940s. We open top-secret defense files in which he planned for attacks on the teeming hordes of Asia, and, in a touching twist, we discover why this white supremacist later changed his mind. Michael Cathcart. Let's turn first to a man who's still seen as one of the very finest minds in our history. His life-saving work on viruses and immunology won him a Nobel Prize in 1960. But there was another very secret and very surprising side to Sir Macfarlane Burnet. Back in the 1940s, when we were afraid of what we called the Asian hordes to our north, Macfarlane Burnet took part in government plans to develop weapons of mass destruction, chemical and germ warfare that could be used against our neighbors. It's the story of a brilliant man who took a journey towards the heart of darkness. In January 1947, Australia's leading biological scientist travels down St Kilda Road, Melbourne. His destination is Victoria Barracks, for a top-secret meeting of a senior defense committee. He's carrying documents which have the potential to change Australia's destiny. These documents will remain secret for decades, and with good reason. Their mission is a biological and chemical weapons plan for Australia, and the scientist is Frank Macfarlane Burnet. Dr. Philip Dorling, historian. As a professional scientist, he was prepared to give some reasonably cold-blooded advice to the Australian government about weapons that today would be viewed with repugnance, and indeed back in the 1940s were certainly viewed as morally dubious, and probably considerably were. Michael Cathcart, but this very grim and secret chapter of Macfarlane Burnett's life has been wiped from public memory. These days this Nobel Prize winner is remembered by most Australians as a great humanitarian. Professor Ian Gust, I think he was a giant. He was head and shoulders above any other biologist in Australia. He was a virologist of the very highest caliber. He then became an immunologist of the very highest caliber. Christopher Sexton, biographer of Burnett. A life. There was a kind of indefinable aura about the man, and it's not because he was a Nobel laureate. It wasn't because he was this great scientist. There was something very unmistakable about his presence. Michael Cathcart, this place is full of happy memories for me. It's Ormond College at the University of Melbourne, and I lived here as an undergraduate in the 1970s, and the most famous person in the college at that time was probably Sir Macfarlane Burnet, who was aged well into his 70s at that stage. And I can remember him giving a seminar in this room on the subject of current medical research, and I came away from that evening with the feeling that I'd been in the presence of a man of extraordinary intelligence, of a kind of humanity, a sort of goodness, really. And I want to understand how that man could have been involved in biological warfare research in the 1940s, and whether it's true that he advocated the use of such weapons. Of course, these were terrifying times. In the Second World War, Australians were facing their grimmest nightmare. We had long imagined that Asia was teeming with potential invaders, all of them looking hungrily at the vast open spaces of Australia. Now that fear had become a reality. The Yellow Peril was making its move. Dr. Philip Dorling, Australia has recently faced the threat of invasion from Japan. The Cold War is developing, the communists are about to take over China, and the mindset is very much one of Australia that is isolated and faces a threat from larger, more populous nations in its region. Michael Cathcart, and this is what really alarmed Burnet as a biologist, the prospect that the populations of Asia were about to explode. Like lots of people, he wondered how a mere 7 million Australians could defend this island continent. In 1946, he wrote, "There will be some desperate problems facing Australia if Asiatic peoples are strengthened by adequate nutrition, and by the conquest of infectious disease. Malnutrition and disease in Asia have alone kept colored populations in check to our north." Michael Cathcart, this is racism of the most basic kind. He believed that the death of Asians due to hunger and disease was a positive, it kept their population numbers in check. How could he think such things? Dr. Philip Dorling, some of his views were reflective of some more conventional wisdom. The difference is then that he then looked at that in terms of what one might do to redress the balance. Michael Cathcart, but how does Dorling know this? Well, he was researching at the National Archives in Canberra when he came across a reference to a secret defense committee on biological warfare. Its principal advisor was Macfarlane Burnet. But when Philip Dorling attempted to access these top-secret documents, the Defense Department said no. And what's the sensitivity that the department was foreseeing? Dr. Philip Dorling, well, the department couldn't initially say what the sensitivity was, because they said that the nature of it was too sensitive to release. Understandably, this pricked my interest. Michael Cathcart, Philip Dorling appealed against the decision, and finally, 18 months later, he got his chance to discover what was in these top-secret defense files. Dr. Philip Dorling, Sir Macfarlane Burnet, and the committee that he was involved in had been contemplating the idea of developing an offensive capability in biological warfare aimed at the agricultural crops of Indonesia and China, and indeed, specifically named Indonesia as a target. Michael Cathcart, no wonder the Defense Department was unwilling to release the documents even 60 years later. They include a secret report by Macfarlane Burnet, Cold War from a biological angle, and it makes chilling reading. Specifically to the Australian situation, the most effective counteroffensive to threatened invasion by overpopulated Asiatic countries would be directed towards the destruction by biological or chemical means of tropical food crops. Dr. Philip Dorling, so he's looking, essentially, at a regional specific weapon, if you like, that would affect Australia's enemies, but not backfire on us, which has always been one of the difficulties of biological warfare, is that once you let something loose, it may come around and bite you. Michael Cathcart, so this is the work of a coldly objective scientist. There's no hint of the humanitarian in his thinking, which is why he wanted weapons to target tropical food crops, so that the temperate crops of Australia would be immune. And can we identify why he particularly was drawn into this? Dr. Philip Dorling, Sir Macfarlane Burnet first provided advice to the Australian government about biological warfare during the Second World War, and he was asked to advise on the possible threat from the Axis powers to Australia, in terms of biological warfare, and indeed, on the allegations that the Japanese were engaged in biological warfare in China. Michael Cathcart, Macfarlane Burnet clearly knew that Japan had ravaged China with biological weapons, devastating crops and slaughtering thousands of civilians with anthrax, cholera, and bubonic plague. Archival footage, Public enemy number one, today as the rabbit menace reaches an all-time high, national leaders, farmers, graziers and local authorities are fighting a vital battle. Michael Cathcart, back in Australia, our own crops were under attack, and the invaders were rabbits. But scientists at Australia's leading virus lab, the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute, had the enemy in their sights. With colleagues at CSIRO, they were developing a potent biological weapon, the deadly myxomatosis virus. Macfarlane Burnet was a key figure at the institute and would shortly become director, and his chief biologist was Frank Fenner. He's a famous microbiologist in his own right, and he's one of the few people alive today who knew Macfarlane Burnet in the 1940s. In fact, the two men were longtime friends. Professor Frank Fenner, Australian National University, you'd have to say he was a very shy man. He took quite seriously his social responsibilities. Michael Cathcart, like Macfarlane Burnet, Frank Fenner was very aware that their groundbreaking research on myxomatosis had huge public benefit. But what Fenner didn't know was that U.S. defense scientists were adapting their methods for war against another mammal, humans. And now that Frank Fenner knows what the Americans were doing, he's astonished at their ruthlessness. Professor Frank Fenner, if they can kill rabbits like that, we could get something that killed humans like that, it'd be wonderful. Laughs. That's the sort of attitude you had to have if you were in that game. Michael Cathcart, so you're actually a pioneer? Professor Frank Fenner, well, to my surprise, I didn't know that. Michael Cathcart, Frank Fenner didn't know that his research was being considered in these terms. Among people working in your field after the war, including Macfarlane Burnet, was there an awareness that this kind of research had military applications? Professor Frank Fenner, no, not at all. And he mentioned it a few times, that influenza, if it could be spread, would be terrible. That 1914-18 kind of influenza. Michael Cathcart, finding a cure for the vicious influenza virus that in 1918 killed more people than the Great War, was the focus of Macfarlane Burnet's scientific attention during those post-war years. At the same time, he was engaged in top-secret meetings at Victoria Barracks on germ warfare. And that's the great irony. Macfarlane Burnet was a world leader in virus research. Research that could be used to cure people or to kill them in time of war. And he recognized that deadly potential. Dr. Philip Dorling, from time to time in the course of his discussions with government about these issues, he had actually identified influenza as essentially the potentially most potent biological agent. Michael Cathcart, it's as though until this time, he'd spent all of his professional life looking down a microscope. And down here, it's very simple. For a microbiologist, there are two kinds of populations and they're at war. And when he was called upon to use his expertise to analyze world affairs, he took the little world down the microscope and projected it onto the globe. Would he have seen it as an ethical issue, the development of chemical weapons? Professor Frank Fenner, I think he got to the situation where the Australian government was worried about biological warfare. I could see then that he regarded it as an important social duty to help the defense forces in any way that he could. Michael Cathcart, but in the mid-40s, did Ben Chifley's government really believe that it needed to prepare for that kind of attack on Australia? Associate Professor Wayne Reynolds, University of Newcastle, Ben Chifley, who is quite determined to pool the scientists, to develop the defense science capability and get Australia involved in the development of scientific weapons, asks you to come in as the leader in the field, as Oliphant is with respect to nuclear weapon, and advise us about the possibility of such weapons. Of course he responds to that. Michael Cathcart, Wayne Reynolds is an expert on Australia's involvement in developing weapons of mass destruction. And we asked him to examine the documents uncovered by Philip Dorling. It appears that in the 1940s and 50s, Macfarlane Burnet made several visits to the top-secret British Biological Weapons Lab at Portorn in the UK. Imagine what it must have been like, this cloistered lab scientist taking his place at the table with some of Britain's best. Associate Professor Wayne Reynolds, Macfarlane Burnet goes to Portorn and comes back and essentially outlines a strategy, an approach, in which the Australians might have a role in the development of biological weapons. Michael Cathcart now have come to the archives of the University of Melbourne, which has an extraordinary collection of the papers and diaries of Sir Macfarlane Burnet. And I've read a heap of stuff here. And it's very clear to me he went on an extraordinary journey, a mental journey, about his attitude to the human race between 1945 and 1960. I found a talk from 1960 which is incredibly poignant. It's a talk he gave to the Rotary Club in Melbourne that year. And he says this: I shall probably be called incredibly naive, but I prefer to believe that all men belong to one species. And that every race responds to human situations in basically similar fashion. At least, faith provides the only hope for a future for civilization. The man who wrote that in 1960 was incapable even of thinking that forward back in 1945. What does his biographer, Christopher Sexton, think? Christopher Sexton, bear in mind, up until the mid-50s, the late 50s, he really did not venture very far beyond simply doing the standard travel visits. mainly to England and to America. Once, however, he did start to step outside the laboratory, then his eyes opened. And I think that did cause a shift. Michael Cathcart, and that's the story I'm finding in Burnett's private papers. When he began to travel, he saw that sheer humanity demanded the sick of India should be cured. In Czechoslovakia and Russia, he encountered people of flesh and blood. The old white supremacist was relenting. He was being moved to a sense of common brotherhood. Sir Gustav Nossel, it's a beautiful portrait, don't you think? When you look at that portrait, who do you see? Who's the man we're seeing in that portrait? Sir Gustav Nossel. Well, I can see the sternness. Michael Cathcart, the brilliant biologist Gustav Nossel, knew Burnet well and followed him as the director of the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute. I caught up with him at his old workplace. So what does Sir Gus Nossel make of Burnet's involvement in the biological weapons program? Sir Gustav Nossel, I literally had no idea of it. It was something that he didn't talk about. It wasn't front of mind in 1957 when I turned up, not at all. Michael Cathcart, so how does he account for Burnet's anti-Asian ideas? Sir Gustav Nossel, don't forget Mac Burnet. Scottish stock, country origins, Geelong College, Ormond College. It's a very waspish view. I mean, yes. That's how the majority of people thought back then. So no, I'm not going to excuse him, but I don't want you to be too tough on him. Michael Cathcart, well, the Nobel Prize winner that I encountered when I was a student, was a man who'd been on an epic journey. He'd learned that, regardless of race, we're all members of the one species, and he was a great scientist. You and I might even owe our lives to him. And whether he was a great ethical thinker, that's a more challenging proposition. End of program. Sir Macfarlane Burnet's beliefs were chilling despite this program's attempt to suggest he developed a conscience later in life. Burnet was linked to the World Health Organization and the Eugenics Society of London. So too is the United States abortion network Planned Parenthood. Bill Gates' father helped establish and ran Planned Parenthood in the USA. According to the Seed in 2017, Planned Parenthood has aborted over 19 million black babies since the 1973 Roe v. Wade case. The case decisions ushered abortion into the USA. Margaret Sanger, who helped establish the abortion network, liked to refer to blacks as weeds. They needed to be pulled up whenever they began to grow. Both Gates Jr. and Sr. have never distanced themselves from Planned Parenthood or abortion as a method of population control. Indeed, Bill Gates has championed abortion in numerous speeches and interviews. Black Lives Matter has been silent on this issue. They haven't been at the door of Gates' home. They've not sought to dismantle Planned Parenthood or attacked and burned Planned Parenthood clinics. These are clinics that have killed more black people than any police. Clinics where black mothers present to white doctors to kill their children. There has been silence on this issue. Why? Could there be a connection between the riots around the world and the COVID-19 pandemic sponsors? The men in the shadows. Have recent riots really been as spontaneous as the media narrative would have us believe? Have the riots been directed? Is there more happening here than meets the eye? Pandemic, riots and destabilization of nations, already reeling from a highly contagious virus that in the final analysis no more dangerous than the common annual flu. A reference to the Rewind declassified intelligence documents is made in a recent book entitled Eyes Wide Open by Fiona Barnett. The 2019 meticulously cited book is free on the internet as it couldn't find a publisher or distributor. Barnett is not so gracious on Burnet or Nossel, as was the ABC Rewind program. The Rewind program made no mention of Burnet and Nossel's connections to the United States Fulbright program. This is an excerpt from Eyes Wide Open. The Fulbright scheme was used to station bioweapons experts in Australia. Arthur Gulston, who helped develop Agent Orange at Fort Detrick in the 1950s, received a 1960 Fulbright scholarship to work with the CSIRO. A 1956 Fulbright scholarship was given to Joshua Lederberg of Fort Detrick to study clonal selection theory. He studied with Sir Gustav Nossel and Sir Frank Macfarlane Burnet at the University of Melbourne. Joshua Lederberg became key to bioweapons development after discovering bacteria can swap genes. His connection to Fort Detrick bioweapon research began in 1949. Joshua Lederberg received the 1958 Nobel Prize and moved to Stanford University. He became president of Rockefeller University, a member of the Defense Science Board and the mysterious Chasen Group. Lederberg currently advises government on bioweapons and bioterrorism. Sir Gustav Nossel is a Jesuit-schooled and Jewish eugenicist. He's a University of Sydney biology major and works as a UN WHO consultant. He also works for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The Rewind program, a shucks approach was, nobody really knew what Burnet was doing. It's feeble considering the declassified intelligence documents. This is especially disingenuous considering that by Burnet's retirement he was widely shunned for his eugenics views, which he continued to write about even after his retirement. The Rewind program ignored this. He moved to Port Fairy, Victoria, where he died on August 31, 1985. His grave headstone reads, "A man who threw off ideas like sparks, which cause a blaze that leapt across to the minds of others." Burnett sure created big ideas. Ideas that in 2020 have got populations living in terror, fear, and lockdown. We're being told we need to be vaccinated to get our lives returned. The significant concern is, have the great sparks from Burnett reached to the mind of Bill Gates and others like him who it seems would welcome the great human population purge? Before we go, may we recommend you get Fiona Barnett's book. It's an academic eye-opener in its references and citations. You will never read its claims in the controlled mainstream media. She also unveils pedophile networks at the highest level of Australian government and society managed by blackmail control files. This is what Jeffrey Epstein did. It produced control files on important and powerful individuals including Prince Andrew, Bill Clinton, and many political, financial, and Hollywood heavyweights. Epstein had links to Bill Gates despite Gates' recent denials. Photos show the two together smiling as friends would. Gates flew on Epstein's jet to Epstein's pedophile island. Was he there for the island's sordid reputation, to secure control files for business leverage, or was he just there to take in the sun? In the absence of admissions, and due to Epstein's convenient demise, we have to assume it was all about the sunshine at Pedo Island. They all went for the sunshine. Barnett's book is a page-turner of intrigue, disclosure supported by documented evidence. She mentions 2 Australian pedophile prime ministers and many living politicians you will recognize today. None have sued her to date, and no mainstream media organization would dare quote her work, let alone to alert the public it exists. Barnett also examines nefarious covert organizations still working within Australia. Her books make the 2004 ABC Rewind program look tame. Eyes Wide Open is worth your time. Conduct an internet search for the book, Eyes Wide Open by Fiona Barnett. The Great Awakening has begun. Q.